MVAI is the future of product management. The ability to whip up a prototype, get it in front of your users as fast as possible, or even synthetic users, and get good feedback. My side hustle for the last 10 years has been teaching product management best practices to enterprise, taught it hundreds of product managers across so many huge companies. And I've come to hate the term MVP. MVP has, at most enterprise, come to mean just version 1, and it typically is bloated. It has none of the original meaning. The way that I've been talking about this for years to product teams is ditch MVP. Let's call it an MVE, minimum viable experiment. I don't think that there's a whole lot of organizations, the big enterprise, that do experimentation well because it's hard, but also because you get a lot of pushback.
Welcome to ODSC's AIX podcast, your gateway to the latest in AI and data science. Whether you're an aspiring data scientist or a seasoned AI professional, we bring you insights from the best minds in the field, shaping the future of AI. This episode is sponsored by ODSC West, the premier AI Builders Conference celebrating its 10th year this October 28th to 30th in San Francisco and virtually. Learn more at odsc.com/California and use the code PODCAST for an exclusive 10% discount. Sheamus McGovern, the founder of ODSC, will be your host today.
I'm very excited for this episode because we'll explore my take on minimum viable AI and Dan's alternative, minimum viable experiment, which focuses on rapid learning over shipping a finished product. We'll also look at the differences between AI as a feature versus AI as a product. Then the risks of AI washing and overpromising. We'll also look at what product managers, data scientists, and AI engineers need to know to work together effectively. So let's jump in. Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Dan, we reconnected on the West Coast at a conference I recently attended, and we want to talk about product management in the age of AI. Before we dive into that, I want to get a sense of your journey. Dan, can you kick us off? What's the origin story behind Gravity AI and what inspired you to build a marketplace for AI models?
Yeah, product in AI is a fantastic topic, not enough discussion around it, so I'm excited to chat about it. That's my background as a product manager. My experience in product led me to this intersection of data science and product management. I spent a number of years at Boston Consulting Group on their digital ventures team. While I'm not a data scientist myself, I somehow became like the data scientist go-to product manager, probably because I was the only PM who understood what the word Bayesian meant. So I fell into this role of being product for all things data science related. And one of my clients there was State Street out in Boston. I ended up being head of product there, focusing on a number of data science products. One of the flagships, Varus, was essentially connecting news with portfolio holdings for State Street customers. We had a pipeline of 27 or so different models strung together, an ensemble model in order to make this happen. And this is before the age of LLMs, right? So like we were using named entity recognition, like we were customizing Spacey, building our own models, our own kind of natural language processing stuff, and along the side of other traditional models. And two kind of things came to my attention while I was there. One, I recognized this kind of commoditization of models that was happening and is happening even today, arguably more today than it was back then, where everything was kind of converging and getting pretty good at certain things. The second was the inability to access and deploy things at scale with any kind of speed. Through that problem that I experienced, birthed this idea of how do I solve this problem for myself? And the initial take on that was a marketplace for models. And I'm using the term model here much more around, because this is back in 2018, can we get production ready Spacey? We were one of the first, if not the first marketplace for AI. We were certainly coming into our own around that exact same time. From there, we've somewhat pivoted. While the marketplace catalog is still up and running and we've got 50,000 data scientists and engineers on there, we, in the process of building this marketplace, birthed a really good MLOps platform for enterprise. And that's really been the focus for us, is allowing enterprise to stand up their own internal marketplace catalog for compliance and governance reasons, which is a very big deal now, as well as for automating deployment. So going from this problem that I was trying to solve of accessing models, getting them deployed in any kind of speed, to where we are today has been almost 7 years at this point.
Yeah, Dan, I think you've captured the market there because once we got our hands on these foundational models, and as you said, there's many different versions of many different flavors. They're coming fast and furious every single week. But it's really that need for putting these in production, right?
Yeah, I think a big
Kind of
focus
key.
for a long time was on the experimentation side,
Yeah.
right? A lot of platforms, the data robots of the world, the Clouderas of the world really focused on, model development, the R&D part of the pipeline. And there was less emphasis placed on inference at scale and the production, the operationalization of it, as you just said.
Yeah. And when you think about MLOps, are you looking at governance, data governance, model governance, compliance, development monitoring? What's your version of MLOps these days?
There's a great pipeline slide that I helped develop with Gartner that breaks down big chunks of it. So you've got your R&D pipeline. This is your data science toolbox, right? This is your Jupyter notebooks, your code repositories, where you're doing training, whether locally or in SageMaker. Then you have your kind of production pipeline segments. So this is your production catalog. So this is where you would stick like your containerized version, ready to go models, as well as your deployment. So are you running batch or real-time inference on these? You've got your customization part of your pipeline. This is your feature store, right? And anything that is part of that deployment pipeline, these all connect together. And underlining all of that is your orchestration and monitoring. This big pipeline now is what I would consider modern, scalable MLOps.
Nice. And getting back to AI and product, as we've heard in your introduction, you've been at the intersection of AI and product across different domains, finance and other industries. That gives you a unique vantage point because throughout your career, I know you speak at a lot of events and conferences and talk to a lot of companies about this. How has that shaped your perspective on where we're headed?
There's a lot of unique ways that as product, we need to be thinking about the direction that AI will take us. I think my worry is that it's going to get treated just like software development. Everyone's throwing AI into everything right now. We can't treat this as software development. And I think I've been able to adapt some of the old frameworks from product into thinking about new ways of categorizing the way that product needs to be thinking about these models. We can take old frameworks, but we need to update them in this landscape. A perfect example of this is that software, for all intents and purposes, either works or it doesn't, right? When I fill out a form and hit submit, I expect that data to go somewhere. If it doesn't, that's a bug. It's broken. You can argue that usability is a factor, but this is very different. This kind of binary approach is very different than this landscape of artificial intelligence, which works within this concept of degrees, performance. Accuracy, obviously, is a very loaded term within data science, but for lack of a better term, it has accuracy, right? And if something is 80% accurate, is that good enough? I don't know. This is the kind of things that product is going to have to really figure out.
Yeah, it's interesting. We did actually have a podcast with the author of AI Snake Oil a couple of months ago. Very good book. And essentially, he was arguing that AI is being used as a label and has been put on products that should have no rights being labeled as such. We can get back to that in a little bit. I do want to delve more into that topic. It's interesting because with my engineering team, I've worked closely with product managers and being part of that product management workflow, definitely in the tech sector. And I work in finance as well. And it goes from that ideation phase to building out the product specification, then the feature specifications, then road mapping. And then, of course, we've got the scope creep, prioritization, and the delivery part of it. And now we're very used to the analytics and feedback. Do you see AI affecting all of that product management workflow, or is it going to affect some parts of it more than others?
Let's define product. There's plenty of analogies for a product manager out there. There's the product managers are the CEO of the product. There's the analogy that we are the conductor of an orchestra, playing translator between engineering, design, and our user base. When you think about what all of that means in context, it means that we are getting work done through others, through our design, our data scientists, our engineers. My role as product in that job is to scale good decision-making across that team. And what that means is I need to help engineers and designers make good decisions. And to do that, I need to give them context. Why are we building what we're building? Who did we hear this from? From our users. All of these are communication skills. Scaling good decision-making is a communications task, a language task. Anywhere you are seeing a language task is somewhere that's going to be impacted by these new paradigms. All parts of the software development and data science development lifecycle from a product perspective are likely going to get impacted here in terms of our ability to leverage these models for better communication at scale across different teams. Great examples of that are probably one of the areas that we're going to see this very soon, if not already, is the writing of things like user stories. I hate that stuff. I hate formatting user stories and epics and breaking it all down and breaking out acceptance criteria. This is a fantastic product related task that could get knocked out by an LLM quite well.
Yeah, Dan, it's interesting what you say. I think that's a very good point. Asking teams to think, why are they building something? You can see this throughout the industry. Many product teams feel pressure to do something with AI, right? It seems to me they don't always have a clear framework for that decision making. Are there any frameworks or mental models that you recommend for project managers evaluating if AI adds real value?
Oh, for sure. And this is shiny object syndrome, right? You see this at executives across every organization. I remember hearing things like, hey, you got to throw some blockchain in your product, right? Like, but do I really? But now AI is like, you got to throw some AI in it. I think Google had the 3 golden rules of AI, which are you don't need AI, you don't need AI, and you don't need AI. The way that I've kind of adapted this to the core of your question around mental models is I've been thinking a lot about the old IDEO assumptions exercise that they created. So IDEO, a big R&D firm, published this assumptions exercise basically across 3 categories: desirability, feasibility, and viability. Desirability is providing value to our end user, right, at its core. How are they solving this problem today? Why is what we're proposing going to solve their problem better? Feasibility is all around, can we do this? Do we have the right skills? Does the technology even exist today to support this in a way that we expect? And then viability is your classic kind of business case. So what are the risks around this? What is our business model? How are we going to make money from this or operationalize our business, save time, money, whatever it might be? And this adapts very nicely into the world of AI. There's definitely a lot of other considerations. I can give you step by step of how I think about this through each of those categories and how product managers should be thinking about it. Desirability as a lens being the core user need. Should we even do this for our user? Software works or it doesn't. AI has this concept of accuracy. There's also this idea of what we do when the model inevitably gets it wrong. Because AI works in degrees and has this concept of accuracy, we need to understand the consequences for when that model gets it wrong and how we're going to handle that. And these are product and design decisions. Taking maybe a couple use cases. If we're doing something like text extraction and classification out of a document, let's say we want to extract information out of a contract, which is a real thing we're doing with one of our clients, one of our earliest clients, things like extracting renewal terms out of a contract. Previously, you just had a paralegal going and reading all of the contract language and extracting those. If I were to say that we were doing that at a 60% accuracy, the client came back and said, well, that's not much better than a coin flip, right? Like if you flip a coin, that's not much better. But is that really the right way to think about that? Probably not, right? Because it's not this idea of probability. What we're really saying by we're getting it right 60% of the time is that we're creating perhaps a 60% efficiency gain. If you take a look at different lenses on this, let's take 2 very, very different things that also are leveraging artificial intelligence. But let's take a look at an Alexa. I'm sorry, I probably just set everybody's off, including my own. And let's take a look at self-driving cars. I've got a Tesla Model 3. I put it in self-driving mode all the time. I love it. But we have degrees of accuracy that are required for very different use cases because the consequences of the model getting it wrong are very different. If you were using your home device like an Alexa, and it could only understand you 10% of the time, you would probably file that Alexa under T for trash, yet it still gets things wrong in its speech recognition pretty frequently, but it's to a degree that we accept that level of error. That level of error is okay. And the consequences of it getting wrong are fairly minimal, right? It just says, hey, I'm sorry, I didn't get that. Please try again. Contrast that with the consequences and need for my Tesla Model 3 when I'm in self-driving. The consequences of it getting that wrong are I'm dead, right? And this has happened to everyone who has ever put their car in self-driving mode. the error handling is commensurate with that level of consequence. So when the model in self-driving mode falls outside of its acceptable bounds, some product team worked very tirelessly with compliance, data science, and the business team to understand the level of risk with which they're going to put those confidence intervals. So when the car falls outside of those, it was a product and design decision of how do we handle this? And the car blares at you to take control of the vehicle. It is very alarming. Anytime it's happened to me, which is probably about 4 or 5 times, I've taken control of that vehicle very quickly. So we need to evaluate as product managers something that is very difficult to evaluate, which is not just does it work, but what level of accuracy does it need to work before it becomes useful? And what are the consequences when the model gets it wrong? All models are wrong, some models are useful. And we need to figure out from a product and design decision how to handle that from an error standpoint. The feasibility and viability buckets are very closely related to software, but there are some unique risks as well. From a viability standpoint, very unique risks with new models in terms of things that have become more commonplace to talk about now, which is obviously like hallucinations. The Air Canada example being a great case that I believe happened last year, where a chatbot made up new terms of service under a specific use case for a user who is requesting a refund for bereavement purposes. Their refund request was not technically part of Air Canada's terms of service. He should not have gotten a refund, but after pressing the model, the chatbot gave him the refund. This went to the courts in Air Canada, basically hallucinated this new terms of service. The courts in Canada ruled that the chatbot was a representative of Air Canada and they needed to honor that refund.
That's
and
right.
It was only like $800, so it was kind of low consequence, but I could imagine that could have gone way worse, right? We have these risks of hallucinations. Bigger risks, though, are around bias. And we can come back and talk about that in length because there's a lot that product teams and product managers need to understand about that. Finally, feasibility, it is imperative that product managers understand the limitations of these models. One of the core limitations that we know is that they're still not very good at math, basic math. If you are a product person and you have this lofty kind of idea in your enterprise that you're going to have this model be doing complex calculations, maybe you're in a financial institution and you want this model to do some math, you need to understand that it's probably not going to do that well. And then other more interesting limitations like the strawberry problem, right? That models are tokenized in such a way that it doesn't understand the concept of letters in the way that we do, right? The strawberry problem being that if you ask a large language model how many instances of the letter R there are in the word strawberry, it comes back with 1 or 2 when there's actually 3. And this is very common for all words. So understanding the feasibility requirements and the limitations of these models is critical. And then finally, in feasibility, there's this whole bucket that we could talk about around that pipeline that we talked about earlier, which is what do we need to get these things from R&D into a production environment and stable and monitored. And these are considerations that product teams need to understand. This is the whole MLOps pipeline. This reminds me of the digital transformation era of the 2010s, where there was an entire new infrastructure that teams needed to understand, whether you were an engineer or a product person. You needed to understand how your content management system for your website connected to your CRM, connected to your data lake. All of that was fairly new infrastructure for product teams that they had to learn. Similarly, it's imperative that they understand these overall pipelines for scaling and deploying AI today.
Yeah, Dan, that's a great answer. Tons to peel back there and unpack. A couple of things that spring to mind when you talk about hallucinations and you talk about accuracy. For the average PM, they of course have to collaborate quite tightly with both the data science teams and the engineering teams. Can you speak a little bit to that collaboration? Because understanding hallucinations is in and of itself a pretty complicated task these days because it's not as obvious as it used to be when a model is hallucinating, right? So that requires additional human feedbacks. AI is a judge, LM is a judge, something else in the loop to understand that. And then the whole definition of accuracy is something quite complex.
First, I think that product folks need to understand that the data science lifecycle is different than the software development lifecycle, that most of that time period is in understanding, obviously, and this is still true in the world of LLMs, right? Still understanding data, right? And cleaning and getting those pipelines set up. And then actually getting this thing built and deployed is only 10% of the process. I once had an executive tell me while we were working on various data science initiatives, this can't be another science project, but like it's science. It's right there in the name that it requires experimentation. Sometimes it's just not going to work. I think it's imperative that product managers understand this is truly a science and
That's
requires
an important point. Yeah.
experimentation. On the question of accuracy and what we need to expect now of product teams, product doesn't need to know the underlying mechanisms by which data scientists go through the process of determining accuracy. Again, loaded term, but we do need to understand the kind of core concepts around this, right? Like precision, recall. We need to understand that things can be tuned in different directions. For instance, the confusion matrix, because there are core product and business decisions that relate to things like risk and acceptable user experience that are product and business decisions that a product manager can work with fine tuning with their data science team. For example, I can create a fraud detection model that blocks all instances of fraud at every single time. How would I do that? I would just block all transactions, right? But that's going to create a horrible user experience. All of those would be false positives labeled as fraud, all transactions. Instead, we can work with our teams to say, what is the acceptable level of fraud and risk? And what is the acceptable level of interruption that a user might have in their day-to-day life for this fraud detection model? We can balance those things.
Yeah, those are very good points. It also brings to mind something I noticed from the venture side. When you're trying to assess a startup more precisely, the problem that startup is trying to solve, they want to look at a particular service or a product. And one key question that we always ask, is this a feature or isn't it actually a product? Something like vector databases where you had Pinecone, VVA, great vector databases, and now every database, Postgres, Oracle, Microsoft SQL is adding this as a feature. A better example I was talking about yesterday is we use Notion in our firm, and Notion has added AI as a feature, right? Notion is this documents, note-taking, collection system. A lot of VC companies use it. We use it. And they've done a really good job of adding AI as a feature. I can see Notion and AI becoming the product. But one issue we see is, I think teams to a certain degree maybe ask themselves that question. How do you distinguish between an AI as a feature versus AI as a product? And why does that matter?
It's really interesting. I'm going to give you a quick hot take and then I'll answer this more directly. I suspect that in 5 years, we're not going to be talking about AI like we're talking about it today. It would be like if I was constantly referencing the internet while I was building something. I'm going to have an internet-enabled product, right? Of course, I'm going to have an internet-enabled product. So we're just not going to have these conversations the same way that we have them today. And this gets at the heart of this idea of a feature or product. You do hear a lot about, oh, that's just a wrapper. And I think that's where people think, oh, this is a feature that gets bolted on and like it's connecting to just this small instance of the platform versus a fundamental change in how the product operates. If I were to draw a distinction between those two things, the feature aspect is something leveraging a series of ensemble models added in as an incremental change. If you're going to evaluate whether or not AI is core to the product, though, there's kind of two aspects to that. One is how are we collecting the data and storing the data? And that is critical to any discussion around whether or not this is a true AI product. Are you taking unstructured data and making it structured through a model so that it can be consumed? And have you built that from the ground up? Then that's core. You might not be using that data for everything, especially as a startup. You might have intended features that can leverage that in the future. But if you're a company and you're happening to rebuild the way that you are doing all of your data collection, you're not AI at your core because it still has to leverage all that. And then two, the second part of this is really around AI. AI is fundamentally changing the way that we think about user interface layers. Just like the web migrated the way we think about user interface over time, we're now seeing a shift in what's possible in user interface. Voice became a user interface in the early ages of, Siri and Alexa. And now we're seeing conversational UI. So conversational UI is kind of the other big kind of tenet, I would say, is at its core. Can I interact with a product in its entirety through chat online or even through voice? And those two things are probably going to be fundamental. And you can't have the UI layer where I can talk through my entire product without the first thing I mentioned, which is how that data gets structured and then consumed.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely key. Voice is the new user interface. We're all waiting for an upgrade to our Apple Siri, Alexa. Again, I'm setting it off now, and Google HomePod. So that's going to be interesting to see how that unfolds. And I guess in relation to that, we all know from product management, especially in the startup scene, it's MVP, minimal viable product. Now, as everyone's talking about AI and product, the new phrase is MVAI, right? Minimum viable AI. And that feels really relevant for teams getting started. So if you want to talk about MVAI, what does that look like? And your insight about reminding product teams, like a lot of this experimentation, right? So we used to do when we were building data science projects, a pilot phase where we could prove the validity of the model, will it actually work in production? But when you're talking about MVAI, what does that look like? And how should product teams work with the data science and AI teams to validate those experiments? Not just from a metric standpoint, but really from a user standpoint, right? Because at the end of the day, this is what product is about, right? The user experience.
Sheamus, one thing we didn't talk about in my background is that my side hustle for the last 10 years has been teaching product management best practices to enterprise, taught at hundreds of product managers across so many huge companies. And I've come to hate the term MVP. So MVP has at most enterprise come to mean just version 1, and it typically is bloated. It has none of the original meaning from when it was coined in the lean startup, which was the smallest thing you could build to learn the most. The way that I've been talking about this for years to product teams is ditch MVP. Let's call it an MVE, minimum viable experiment. And because that puts any notion of happening to build working product out the window, because it shows that we're just putting the emphasis on learning. I don't think that there's a whole lot of organizations, the big enterprise, that do experimentation well, because it's hard, but also because you get a lot of pushback. I've heard this everywhere, even like the most sophisticated tech places where there isn't room, time, budget, whatever it is for experimentation. We just need to build. We're being pressured to ship. There's no money for this or time. And there is no excuse anymore with this MVAI. This is the future of what product managers are going to do. Not only do they need the skills that we talked about, like understanding the concept of accuracy and how to communicate with your data science teams, but product managers are going to become prototype machines. Like we should be prototyping like crazy. A very early kind of working interface can get whipped up and created is monumental today. And I'll pause. I have a couple examples for you, but just to put a cap on that, and we can get into those examples in a minute. MVAI is the future of product management. It is the ability to whip up a prototype, get it in front of your users as fast as possible, or even synthetic users, and get good feedback. So there's no excuse anymore for waiting or not experimenting at all.
Nice. But there is a bit of a trap there, because I've done a few talks earlier this year. I wanted to do, as we say in the VC industry, a quick demonstration of magic. For Q1 of this year, one of my favorite demonstrations of magic has been just to ask the audience, like, what would they like to build? And maybe someone said something like, build me a Spotify for YouTube videos. And then I'd fire up Bolt or Lovable. And as I'm speaking, Lovable would generate a great user interface in the background. And then I also have a lot of friends who run engineering consulting firms where they'll build a product from scratch. And now they find they get these inquiries. Hey, I just built this thing in Lovable. Can you convert this into a product? So a trap I see there, we're democratizing AI and software development, making it more accessible to everybody, including product managers. But there is that temptation to overpromise with AI. That can lead to AI projects being overscoped or even misapplied, right?
That's a risk. I would say if that risk is present, that product person isn't necessarily doing a good job of evaluating all of the things that product needs to be thinking about. When we think about experimentation, right, or in this case, like building an MVAI, like you're setting a learning objective. what do I need to learn from this? And as you mentioned, in many cases, it probably is around that bucket of desirability. Do we have a concept that at its highest level is desirable? In many cases, though, you might be testing something at a slightly higher level of fidelity to learn more about. We have a large commercial real estate client that we are doing some automations for and agentic work. While we are primarily a platform, we do strategic builds with our clients that leverage our platform. So we'll strategically select a consulting engagement and build something out that uses Gravity AI at its core. We're doing that for these guys and need to understand their existing workflow. That came from field product work, user interviews, mapping out their existing workflow today, and looking at how their current internal employees are managing their documents and how that gets from one system to another. So after mapping out that workflow, what we were able to do with vibe coding, and by we, I mean literally just my designer in Figma using some the vibe coding tools that Figma has put in place, whipped up a couple designs based off of that workflow and created a working version of that we were then able to get feedback on. Is this workflow correct? Do we have this right from the standpoint of the end user? The speed in which we're able to get user feedback on are we in the right direction is really high. Now, you bring up a good point because I have to resist this urge too. I want to go directly to my CTO and say, all right, let's build this. We got confirmation. But there's big back-end feasibility questions, right? All of this goes back to this kind of core framework of what are my assumptions around desirability, feasibility, and viability. From my feasibility assumptions, is this workflow possible? What would it take to productionalize this? What systems are in place? And yes, we've gotten user feedback that this is a desirable, that this is cool, that this fits correctly into the workflow, but can we implement this in the way that we think? And what are those trade-offs? So still, good product managers are going to have to communicate with their data science and engineering teams no matter what.
Yeah.
I'm still not going to be able to build all of the back end on this as a product manager,
Yeah.
although that might change, but we still need a lot of the implementation, thinking through feasibility around this.
Yeah. Product managers already have a pretty deep skill set to master. It's interesting what you say about vibe coding. Vibe coding is now part of the product conversation for sure, right?
Yeah.
Figma being one of the primary examples, as you mentioned. I would assume that product managers are wondering if they need to go deeper here. Do you think product managers should learn prompt engineering? And if so, at what depth? Because that's a big part of vibe coding, right?
I've been on the record many times, so I should come out and say this right out. I've been on the record many times that prompt engineers and prompt engineering isn't, I believe that at some point, and I will eat my words if this ends up being wrong in the future, but I believe at some point we're going to talk about it the same way we talk about Googling something. It's like, did you take that Googling training? Did you learn how to Google? We're all just naturally going to start getting kind of good at it. With that said, and I guess this is within the scope to prompt engineering, we do, as product people, need to have an understanding of like, what are it's like spec engineering, right? Like, what are the specs that need to go into this? The short answer to your question is absolutely. If you look at the job of the product manager is to scale good decision making by creating good context, by communicating out ideas to everyone. One of the best ways that we can communicate ideas is by whipping up a kind of junk interface that says, this is generally the direction that I want us to go. And the speed at which we'll be able to communicate what would be otherwise much more complex concepts through vibe coding is going to drastically increase. So understanding the spec aspect of prompt engineering, like what do I need to iterate on this so that I get a decent result? I'd say that's a pretty important skill. I do think that the models now are getting good enough that they can guide you through this process, though. We're all just going to start kind of naturally, as a society, build up this skill set, just like we naturally built up getting good at surfing the web or Googling something. It's going to evolve. Imagine that you're an XYZ at this company in this role. Even that's taking the wayside. That was a very popular starting prompt. It's just not quite as needed anymore as the models get more sophisticated.
No, I definitely agree. I do believe there will be certain niche defined roles. Prompt engineering is so important, but I do see prompt engineering as a skill. You have different types of skill depending on your role. Like prompt engineering as an AI engineer is different from a machine learning engineer or data scientist. Prompt Hearing for someone in marketing and sales, some of the product, there's going to be a set of skills related to prompt engineering within that role. So I see that prompt engineering skill has become very important as opposed to a distinct job role. Because that begs the question, like for this new generation of product managers, for the next generation of, what do you think the new skills or even instincts do you think will define the next generation or great product managers?
I think it's going to, as is probably the case with a lot of how most roles are going to be changing, emotional intelligence, curiosity, and experimentation in this new world of AI. Those things are going to become extremely important.
Intelligence. Tell me more.
Yeah. So the role, as we kind of alluded to, the role of product here are you're going to be able to experiment at a scale that we just haven't been able to do before because it required resources. I had a 30-minute hackathon last week with an AI group here in San Diego, and we created a pitch for a credit repair AI that would send letters to credit agencies on your behalf, negotiating to remove something from your credit report because you paid it and they just haven't removed it. Or you can sometimes just negotiate with these credit companies. There's actually whole teams in India who write these letters for you today. This was kind of an interesting thing that we wanted to tackle. So we used the platform Gamma to create a pitch presentation for this, all in less than 30 minutes. I used Claude Code to whip up a very interesting prototype of how this would look. I can create a version of this that communicates so much more than any pitch deck could. If I wanted to take this to an engineering team, do I think that's going to ever look the same as it did from what I coded that night? As a communications tool, either to my end user or to my engineering team, it's invaluable. I'm going to have to iterate, and I'm going to be able to iterate like crazy. I went through a bunch of different prompts. In this particular case, I combined GPT-4 to help generate images of the workflow. Because it was such a limited amount of time, I wanted both of them run, right? So I'm generating images of the workflow in GPT-4, downloading those, and then putting those into Claude Code to start to generate this workflow for myself. I had to iterate on that process and that prompt quite a bit to get what I want at the end of the day. So it's not being afraid to just let the thing do what it's going to do, and then to say, hey, that's not right, to treat it a little bit like a partner in the moment, to communicate with it and have a conversation. And those are skills that we naturally have with our engineers and data scientists. We just need to translate some of that into communicating with these LLMs.
Yeah, I think, Dan, the key word you mentioned there is partner, because that's something I've been focusing a lot in the last few months, because we're building out some agentic workflows and we're trying to see what we can do there, not to just treat AI as a tool, but treat it as a collaborator. So do you see AI impacting product management where it's looking like AI is almost like a co-PM anytime soon? Seems like a lot of product managers are trying to get there.
Yeah, just like we talked about at the start of this, product management is fundamentally a communications role, right? We're a translator providing that context. And anytime there's this kind of language aspect to our job, you're going to be able to partner. I'm not sure that we're there yet, but we're going to see us partnering very closely with AI that learns all about our product, has access to our code base, automates a decent amount of stuff that we hate doing. I push a new branch of code into production and it generates release notes for me. As part of an agentic workflow, decides to send out an email with those release notes, or whatever it might be, to the right stakeholders. A big part of the product is kind of user research and competitive research, trends, landscape research. We're already kind of seeing agentic natures to things like the deep research capabilities within GPT-4. All the models now kind of have this kind of reasoning capability. And it's truly agentic because it's deciding where to go look on the web and pull this information. And when deep research first came out in GPT-4, you better believe that I immediately put it to task of researching all my competitors, pulling up the whole ML ops landscape. And it did, in 15 minutes, what would take me and a team an enormous amount of time. In those senses, we're already seeing that partnership at play. It's just going to deepen, because it's going to get connected and have so much more context about what we're working in every day.
I can absolutely see that, because a lot of projects I work on are internal projects for internal users only, not to the wider world.
That's most product people that I know are
Yeah.
actually building internal products.
As an engineer, I've finally recognized late in my career that I'm terrible at product development. We had this internal dashboard for this agentic workflow I was talking about. And we were discussing, like, we need to pull in a UX engineer here because we got some very pointed feedback about our most recent dashboard, our most recent control panel. I said, listen, guys, let's do something similar here. I took a screenshot of our dashboard and gave that to deep research, got some feedback on that. That was actually very good feedback. And then we tried to use, to a lesser extent, use Operator or one of these agent routers. Didn't work so well, but almost simulate a user and how do we click around there. So already people are coming up with some great ideas to use as a skill. Since so much of our audience is made up of data scientists, AI engineers, I want to flip the lens here for a second and go back to an earlier point. Collaboration between technical teams and product teams is crucial, as we mentioned earlier, for any product success, especially when you're integrating AI. But it's, as we all know, that's not always seamless. So what should data scientists and AI engineers expect from product managers in AI projects and vice versa? How can I, as a data scientist and AI engineer, help the product team develop products?
For a long time, data science has been siloed away from product teams. Reminds me of early engineering teams, even before we had this modern concept of product, siloed away from the rest of the org. Now we're seeing cross-team collaborations. There should be new expectations on your product manager if you're a data scientist. They need to make better asks of you to understand what it is that we're building. Let me elaborate. A product manager should be expected to, as we talked about before, understand the concepts of performance. So when I'm talking to my data scientist and they're giving me precision and recall, I can weigh in on this in the correct way. I also need to understand, and it should be expected of product managers, to understand the data science lifecycle and how that's different than that software development lifecycle, where my time is spent, that some things aren't going to go the right way. Part of that might be understanding that I can get my model to 80% accuracy in 3 months, but to get it to 82% accuracy is going to take another 3 months. You start getting these diminishing returns. This is something that products should start to understand, of the nature of data science and how these models get built. And I think the other really big thing that should fall on product is understanding and helping the data science team get good data. Good data can mean lots of things. We want representative data. They should understand things like bias. So if I think about good data for a model that's going to extract text out of a receipt, you might say good data looks like a bunch of pictures of receipts where they're perfectly clear, extremely legible. I can take all of these images of these very clear, good looking receipts and add that into my model. But that's actually not like if I was going to do this in reality, right? What a good image of a receipt looks like, because there's user behavior. We all know that receipts sit in our wallet forever. They become faded, they become crumpled. So that actually changes what a good receipt looks like from a user standpoint to get it out into the real world. And that's exactly what product does, right? Is understand user behavior. So a good receipt, we have examples of a very nice, crisp, easily read receipt. But we also got to make sure that we have real world examples of crumpled receipts, receipts that are faded and things that have handwriting on them so that things work in real contexts. That's good data. You should expect a product manager to know that. On the concept of bias and ethical concerns around this, I kind of categorize these two they're two big categories of bias. One is statistical bias, where our data set isn't representative of the world. This is a product team problem. A great example is, came out that facial recognition technology a few years ago was really bad, from IBM, from Amazon, from a number of others, really bad at recognizing people of color, particularly women of color, significantly worse than white males. This is a statistical problem, right? There's no harmful intent. It just means that you had a team who didn't have enough data representation of people of color and women of color in their data set. And this is something that a product manager can look at and work with the data science team on. This is also a failure of the product team as part of the QA process. Clearly, there was probably just some dude who looked like me saying, hey, this model works great. So this is a product team level of bias that product managers need to be aware of how to communicate with your data science team. The other side of that, though, is the whole societal bias problem, where our data set is as accurate of a representation of the world as we're going to get, but there's inherent societal bias baked into that data set, this is much more complicated to deal with. And this is the area where product teams need to be able to recognize this and probably consult compliance, legal, and a fast growing role of an AI ethicist. These are big ethical questions that I don't necessarily think that a data scientist or a product manager for some of these societal problems are fully equipped to handle. Definitely something that needs to get consulted with experts who have thought through this, right? Think like trolley problem level questions when it comes to these models.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, especially at the time of recording. As we saw with Grok being released, there's all kinds of ethical risks, releasing that the EU is looking into some of the statements coming out of that LLM. So yeah, any tools that PM should think about, of course, they need to work closely with their AI engineering and data science teams, but any tools that PM should think about for looking at ethical risks, whether it's bias or hallucinations when deploying these AI features, should be more just about talking to their teams.
Yeah. And still something that, when I talk to teams, it's a tough problem to solve and just hasn't been fully solved. And there's plenty of organizations out there that are working on it. I think you nailed it, though. I think it's actually the latter that you mentioned. I don't expect product managers to be experts in the techniques that we go and all of the tools for measuring bias. I think, though, they need to be good at talking with their data science, their ML engineering teams, around how we're going to measure this and what is our ongoing process for monitoring all of this. So recognizing that we have to monitor these models for performance and that they might not perform the way we expect them to, and we need to constantly monitor that. Understanding how we talk about those upper and lower bounds, what does that look like as it's within performance? So understanding how to have those conversations with the data science team as opposed to becoming experts in it themselves. Because again, we're trying to empower the rest of our team. We're getting our work done through them so they can provide the context, right? Going back to my Tesla Model 3 example, what is the level of confidence that the model needs to have while it's in self-driving mode? That's kind of a business and risk decision combined with a what's possible decision, right? So what can we do? And what level of risk are we willing to take on for this model to fall outside of the bounds? And then finally, what do we do when inevitably the model does fall outside of the range that we have set? How do we do error handling, right? And that's obviously the big product and design decision.
Definitely, because that should give product managers pause for thought, because there's so much excitement around AI right now. People view it as a win-win when I don't believe that's necessarily the case. At worst, you can be accused of AI washing, using AI where it doesn't belong. You cited a few examples earlier where it wasn't properly tested. That adds a lot of risk. In one case, I was listening to a podcast about Duolingo where the chief product officer was creating about this great product they created, which is Duolingo. My kids use it. I was using it for a while. It's a great product. But then I just heard a couple of weeks ago that people are leaving Duolingo in droves because with the AI rollout features, people really do not like some of the AI features. No judgment on Duolingo. I think it's an awesome company, awesome products. If you're a product manager or even an AI engineer, look at what's happening with Duolingo now. And I'm sure they're a good company. They'll correct this. But there's pressure to roll out AI. Some of that pressure came from an online learning company last year who, in their earnings report, mentioned AI as a potential risk and lost a third of their market value. That led a lot of pressure to a lot of CEOs to say, okay, what's our AI strategy? And that trickled down to the AI product team and say, okay, we need an AI strategy because we got to keep our stock up there or whatever. And okay, maybe that's a cynical view, but like you, I've worked in Wall Street, so that's not that actual cynical. It's true. Just read the earning reports. It's right there in black and white. So at the worst, you've got AI washing, which again, I don't think people really want to do. That's pretty bad. But then you have this pressure. How do teams truly differentiate their product with AI? Because a lot of teams don't have the option to build an AI native product from the ground up, right? It kind of goes back to something like Notion. I think Notion is doing a good job of adding AI into their platform, at least from what I heard, and I use Notion as well. They're using AI to differentiate their products versus something like Jasper, which is a writing product. I think they're still doing well, but Jasper was built as a AI native writing product. So yeah, so I'm throwing a lot at you there from everything from AI whitewashing to differentiating the products. How should teams thinking about using AI truly differentiated products when they don't have options to be AI native products?
Yeah. Rebuilding your product from the ground up, right? You mentioned beyond AI washing now, like there's agent washing everywhere. Everything is agentic now. I'm even a little bit guilty of that. We're truly building some agentic workflow stuff into the platform, but I'm also buying into that hype. And
Yeah.
and I understand that pressure that these companies are experiencing, though. We are at peak hype, but the speed at which I'm seeing this implemented far outpaces anything that happened during the digital transformation era. And while we haven't, and I'm using we as an enterprise and companies haven't figured it all out, there's going to be winners and losers in this space for sure. We're going to see a lot of companies go the way of blockbusters. And I think that speed is real. I think that is a fair concern. I don't think we figure out exactly what that means in terms of implementing these features. Companies should experiment and kind of build their lighthouse, right? Like a beacon of success that they can point to use my old BCG consulting speak, something they can point to in a low risk environment. Typically, those low risk environments are probably going to be something internal, right? An internal user to the organization can leverage something. Now, they can consume the model, right? Where they're leveraging Copilot or ChatGPT as the interface. Now, obviously, that's not AI within their product where they're purely consuming it. And there's a whole spectrum, right? Going from consumption to full integration. And that's a good place to start is let's just consume this internally, see what it's capable of, play around with it and experiment in a low risk environment on our internal users. So that's a great place to start. You want to be able to claim that in your product company, but don't do AI washing. Just don't do it. You're basically just lying at that
Too
point.
good.
I will say there's only one other problem here, though, is this industry has had a nomenclature problem for 15 years, right? Everything, this is the classic joke, right? What is AI? It's everything that just hasn't been created yet. The bar always changes. So like was what I built at State Street AI? Certainly was before this concept of large language models, but it was a giant ensemble model. It was definitely in the field of data science, and I would call it artificial intelligence. So in that regard, we have to redefine this nomenclature of AI as a society. I think they need to have well-structured AI use case and data readiness assessments. This is something that I do as a consultant for companies, and Gravity AI does a structured workflow analysis, identifying where we have data that is appropriate to be leveraged here, and where are there language or automation tasks that are appropriate for a model to be used, and on a scale, across desirability on a scale that's providing enough viability that it's helping the business out, and feasibility and viability that it's low risk. So can we identify those areas? And it doesn't even have to be flashy, because if AI is doing its job appropriately, we don't necessarily even recognize that it's there in some cases, except for human in the loop processes. Start at these incremental bits of the organization and then decide what aspects of my business do I need to reimagine from the ground up, and then start from that ground up, right? Like, because you're truly going to have to rebuild from the ground up that product, but have that incremental start. It's okay.
No, absolutely. And and just for our listeners, AI washing is really a thing. I don't want to name names because many of the lawsuits are still in progress. I might include a link to the SEC page on this. There's some interesting accusations from the SEC and publicly traded companies about AI washing, which is prolific in the startup industry as well. I kind of want to bring this back to your platform because, and I know this is something that PMs will maybe run from, but they should not. Most PMs are, of course, not MLOps experts and forget about DevOps experts, but they still need to guide AI projects responsibly and effectively. So for product managers who aren't technical, what's the minimum they should understand?
An analogy I use a lot, and maybe I've overused it now, but is this kind of shift that we went from in the late 90s, early 2000s in the web, where Web 1.0 was characterized by, like, if you wanted to make a change to any website, you needed to send a ticket to somebody called the webmaster, right? Who was off siloed on their own and had complete control because they knew how to code. And then we shifted from Web 1.0 to Web 2.0, this idea of the content management system, right? Your Wixes, your WordPresses, your Shopify's. And within that world, you still needed engineering teams to customize and build out the frameworks for these backends, but it took the power and enabled product teams and marketers, whoever it might be, to leverage aspects of the platform and kind of this kind of self-service capacity. We're in the midst of this shift right now from AI 1.0 to AI 2.0 in the same sense that we had from Web 1.0 to Web 2.0. I should have ML ops that allows me as a product team to self-serve, deploy, and test some of these things. Part of my stack, as I mentioned earlier, is that data science stack. I'm not going to be super involved in it as a product manager, That's my R&D stack, my Jupyter notebooks, where I'm doing my training. Obviously, I'm going to have my code repositories that we're all very familiar with as product teams. Deployment stack, right? My catalog, where I can monitor and know what's in production. With the latest EU AI Act, you cannot separate a model from deployment. So I need to document where a model is deployed. I need to be able to audit it, because I could have the same model deployed for an internal product, exact same model, and it's deployed in critical infrastructure, and the risk levels, according to the EU AI Act, are going to be different and have different requirements and different auditing requirements. So I need somewhere where I can keep an eye on those. And then I need to automate my deployment process so that good IT teams build these types of self-service capabilities where I can get stuff deployed out. Very much like in kind of this idea of Web 2.0, where I can control getting things out in a workflow with approvals. We should have that now and understand that as part of our MLOps pipeline. And then kind of adjacently to that, in the product manager's toolbox should be these rapid prototyping coding tools, right? This is your, as you mentioned, cursors. I think Claude Code at time of recording is probably one of the favorites right now. These should be part of your product manager toolbox for creating rapid prototypes. And then you have all of this stuff happening behind the scenes for integrating into your overall development pipeline, right? Writing your user stories, automating burn down charts and productivity, code reviews, writing release notes or update emails. All that stuff is part of the product manager job that should be in my stack.
Excellent. And does Gravity AI help product managers with some of these challenges of deploying and managing machine learning models? Because I know it's a very approachable platform.
We were way early to the market with this, in my opinion. Now, this is kind of exactly the use case. A lot of emphasis was put on that R&D portion, as I mentioned before, and a lot of companies invested in that R&D portion of getting models built. But now it really is like, how do we get them into a production environment stably in a way that we can audit them, that's compliance friendly? And we've built the platform with this product team mindset where I can set up teams in Gravity AI. My data science team and ML engineers can upload a model. It does all of the work of the ML engineers for it. As a product manager, I can access it in a no-code way and play around with it. If everything looks good, I can publish it, set risk levels, document it, and grab an API so that anyone on my engineering team can grab it. But really, again, like making what previously was only accessible to a data science team significantly more accessible to a product team as a whole. So, yeah, little shameless plug for Gravity there. Thank you, Sheamus.
Yeah, and I'll include a link as well, because I have been checking out some of the blogs. Very interesting. And I guess to end this conversation with some perspective, because I'm sure we'll have product managers listen to this. I'm sure we'll have a lot of our regular audience who are engineers, data scientists, beginning their journey, or very experienced practitioners. But I think what they all have in common is at some point they're going to think about building an AI product, right?
Yes.
So if you're advising a team, whether it's a technical team, like I just mentioned, or a product team, if you had one piece of advice to give to a team just beginning their AI product journey, what would it be?
Understand why am I doing this with AI? Going back to Google's top 3 rules of AI, you don't need AI. Is this because an executive told me to, or is this actually going to add value? I run an AI infrastructure company. I want you to be building AI, but you don't need AI for everything. Overly scoping and throwing this stuff in there is going to lead to a lot more headaches than it potentially could solve. So if you can fundamentally answer that question, why we're doing this, and you have a good reason, and it fits neatly within desirability, feasibility, and viability, that's where you need to start. It's an unsatisfying answer, but it's true. We should push back. We should say no to many AI things and viciously prioritize what we're actually putting into these kind of multimodal models that we might want to leverage.
No, I think it's so important. So I always just question why that one word works with a lot of things. Dan, how can people follow your work?
I am not on all the socials, but feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. That is primarily where I spend a lot of my time. So again, just Daniel Huss. Gravity AI also has a moderately active YouTube channel. Our website is gravity-ai.com. Someone is sitting on gravity.ai and wants a couple $100,000. Maybe one of these days we'll buy it. You can find our YouTube channel by searching for Gravity AI or myself. We put out some pretty fun content there as well, so give it a look.
Yeah, I can attest that's pretty good. And I'll include some links to the show notes as well. So Dan, I got to say, so happy I connected with you again. And you definitely provided some excellent insight into the world of AI and products. Thank you so much, Dan. I really appreciate your time.
Absolutely my pleasure, Sheamus. Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, Dan. So Dan, we'll talk again.
Absolutely.
So goodbye.
Cheers.
Your engagement directly contributes to the growth and success of our community. Please subscribe now and don't miss out on the next enlightening episode. This episode is sponsored by ODSC West, the premier AI Builders Conference celebrating its 10th year this October 28th to 30th in San Francisco and virtually. Learn more at odsc.com/California and use the code PODCAST for an exclusive 10% discount. Supporting our podcast by subscribing not only helps our small dedicated team at ODSC, but also unlocks exclusive benefits for you.